My name is Beverly Sanders, and today is August 13th, 2013. I'm visiting with Dianne and Dianne Bauman in McFarland Memorial United Methodist Church in Norman, Oklahoma. This interview is for the historical records of McFarland United Methodist Church, as well as the Voices of Oklahoma United Methodism project of the Oklahoma Conference Oral History Research Program, which is coordinated through the Commission on Archives and History with the support of the Oklahoma United Methodist Historical Society. Both Marion and Dianne have been very much involved in activities and events at McFarland for a good many years, and both are still actively involved in their individual activities as well as jointly. As Marion said, as we scheduled the interview, they work as a team. So today I'm speaking with both members of that team. Marion and Dianne, we appreciate your coming in and taking the time to share some of your memories of McFarland with us. Let's start by having each of you introduce yourself and tell us about historically, your story of your association with McFarland and different positions you have been in and just all that sort of thing. So Dianne, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I'm Dianne Bauman. We moved to Norman in 1974 and joined the church at that time. So we've been here for almost 40 years. We're members of the Searcher Sunday School class and have been from the beginning. We have both been active in a lot of different commissions and boards. I've been president of the United Methodist Women, finance chair, when we had Council on Ministries chair. We have helped with a couple of finance campaigns. We've just been active, and as well as doing the finance campaign for the addition to the church.
Okay. Marion, how about you? Tell us your story.
Basically the same thing. I mean, we've both been very active on many commissions. I was chair of finance, chair of the administrative board, chair of trustees, chair of the building committee. One of the co-chairs of fundraising. And so we've been involved in virtually all aspects of McFarland over the years.
Now you say you came in 1974. Would you tell us a little bit about what McFarland was like at that time, both the condition of the building, what the congregation was like, what sort of things were going on activity-wise at that time? What can you remember about when you came here in 1974?
I probably remember more about the building. I mean, at that time, the property that McFarland owned was the footprint of our original sanctuary, our original building, and part of what's now the west parking lot, most of what's now the west parking lot. The building was not in a good state of repair, and of course the congregation was much smaller at that time. I don't know the exact size, but the congregation was very active, and I think it's always been very active.
Were you put onto a committee or an office right away, or was it a while before you entered in?
No, it was a few years. In fact, it was really after Phil came that Finance Crutchfield was still here when we came. Not Finance Crutchfield.
It was, Wayne Coffin.
Wayne Coffin, yes, wrong name. Wayne Coffin was here when we came, and then Jack Featherston followed him. And it was really shortly after Phil came that we started getting a lot more active.
Yeah. Dianne, how about your impressions?
They're about the same as Marion's, but we did find that the people were, friendly, and we particularly got involved with the Sunday school class. And that was mainly where we were involved. We had a very small child at that time, and then we had another one not shortly after we came here, and so that was taking up most of our, or at least my time.
Did you become active in UMW right away?
I was semi-active in UMW. Didn't become real active until the kids got just a little bit bigger.
Can you all tell us any specifics about the condition of the building? We have seen some pictures that show all kinds of terrible things, like the ceilings falling down, and was that at that time, or were those from another time?
No, it was at that time. I mean, the sanctuary was leaking, roof was leaking, and so there were, in fact, there were basically water leaks all over the building. And and so that was evident on ceilings particularly.
We didn't have any carpeting.
Yeah.
It was all linoleum. We
Yeah,
didn't have carpeting. It was all,
Yeah, in fact, the flooring in all of the Sunday school wing was the original battleship linoleum that had been put in when the building was built. And actually, there were still pipes sticking out of the floor from the original steam heat system. So, you know, it had not been, well, there were a lot of it did date back to when the building was originally built, and had not been updated.
Do you remember when it was that we began to try to take care of some of those things that were?
yeah, Phil.
Yeah, it was after Phil came, and of course, the first big thing was the bond program that we did to repair the sanctuary.
Right.
And
the office wing.
And the office wing, right.
Redo the office wing.
And because those areas, you know, really needed some maintenance and updating. And so that was the first big item, I would say. So that would have been, you know, not very long after Phil came, within the first couple of years after he came, and I've forgotten when he came. But what, in late 70s? Yeah.
Somewhere.
Yes, yesterday Phil was doing an interview with Buddy Pendarvis for us, and they talked about the bond issues. I believe that he said that there were some quite a few legal hang-ups as far as getting the okay on the bonds.
There were, and of course, Buddy would know more about that than anyone else, because he was the church's lawyer doing all of that. But anyway, it did get done, and the project got done, so, which was very beneficial.
And I believe there's been more than one time. So that time you said was right after Phil came?
Yes.
A little bit later, was there another major renovation?
Well, there have been other, it was really part of the building project that we did. We did a lot of updating other places. Then, actually, just in recent years, there's been some additional work on the sanctuary, particularly the roof, to stop water from coming in, because that's been a continual problem.
At that time, did you feel that McFarland was needing more space or just simply repairs? Were we in need of space?
No, McFarland needed a lot more space. I mean, basically, we had been in the same building at that time for more than 50 years. We had clearly outgrown all the facilities. Parking was a major issue. We used to park on the street down a block, a couple of blocks away. And so there were many major issues associated with the growth that the church was experiencing.
Yeah. We'd run out of Sunday school.
Yes.
Yes.
And so there was a very definite need for more Sunday school space.
I believe at that time we had Sunday school classes meeting on the fourth floor landing.
Oh, yes, we had Sunday school classes meeting on all the landings,
And
basically.
in the little room behind the, back behind the
Sanctuary.
stage in the sanctuary.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were using every nook and cranny when we were out.
At one point, McFarland had drawn up a long-range plan showing use of this lot back here on the north, and for several different kinds of buildings and all. Can you tell us anything about that?
Well, actually, that happened in the mid-'80s. Dave Stapleton was chair of the trustees at that time.
Do you want to turn it off?
Oh, that's me.
I know, but
That's my daughter. Oh, sweetie, I'm gonna need to call you. Start again. Dave Stapleton was chair of the trustees back at that time, and Phil is really the one who got that process going. And Dave was an architect with the University of Oklahoma. So a very knowledgeable person on buildings and space, land usage. And the trustees, under his guidance, developed a long-range plan for utilization of all of the block that the church sits on. Of course, we didn't own any of it.
The long-range plan was before we owned all of them?
We didn't own any of it. We
my.
just owned the original building still.
Oh.
But actually, Dave, completed that long-range plan. It went through the Planning Commission and the City Council of Norman. Dave did a lot of discussion with all of the neighbors around the church back at that time frame. There were many neighbors who were not in favor of expansion of the church. They wanted to keep the neighborhood just like it was, which was in a deplorable rundown condition, but that's how they liked it. But in fact, there was a very active neighborhood association back then. They used to meet at sort of headed by the man who has the grocery store a couple of blocks northeast of us. Is it Midway? Is that it? But Dave had many meetings with that neighborhood group, and ultimately at least got them to the point that they weren't going to actively oppose us. And so that was all approved probably, 86, 87, 88, sometime in that time frame.
Well, there was also a church long-range planning committee that came maybe a little later when we were trying to determine whether or not we would build more.
Yeah.
And so in order to get the whole congregation on board, we had a long-range planning committee and input from the whole congregation on what needed to be done and where we ought to go.
And that was about when?
Oh, that would have been...
In the 90s sometime?
Oh, no.
Late 90s?
No.
No?
We were starting building in the mid-90s.
Oh, okay.
It would have been probably 89, maybe 1990. And in fact, we did a survey of the entire congregation. We sent out something like 1,000 survey forms, asking many questions, including do you think we need additional space? What type of space do you think we need? All sorts of things like that. It was a simple questionnaire, but 10 or 12 questions asking questions like that. We got an amazing response back on that. Typically, when you send out questionnaires like that, if you get back 20 or 30%, you're doing good. We got back 70 to 80% of them, and overwhelmingly, the congregation felt we needed to do something. And the greatest need that people identified was educational space and things along that line. And so that was really the first step in the process that led ultimately to the expansion.
So was that church long-range plan somewhat or pretty much the same as the long-range plan that was filed with the city?
No, it really didn't have anything to do with what was filed with the city.
It didn't actually have the buildings or which buildings we would have?
No, in fact, we didn't discuss, and at that particular time, we didn't discuss which buildings. And I should back up a little bit. One of the things that Dave did work out with the neighborhood association is that we gave a commitment to them that we would never build large buildings on the north half of the block. And any buildings on the north half of the block had to be residential in character. And so although Dave's plan that was approved by the city did show some large buildings up there, we'd given a commitment to the local residents that we would not do that. And Dave had done that as part of his project. So no, at the time that the survey was done, no plans were presented. We were just asking questions, what do you think we should do?
Did we have the property at that time?
No, still didn't have any property.
What was the question, Diane? I didn't.
Was the property, did we have any more the property?
We had acquired the Aldersgate building. Now, you should be aware that although we didn't own any property, we had several members that were actively acquiring property for our benefit. Principally among them were James McCall and Harold Hunicke. Harold had acquired some properties on this block, on the block the building's on. James McCall had acquired basically all the property across the street south of the church, with the intent that they wanted to make that available to the church whenever the church wanted to do something. And so, you know, even going back into the early 80s or maybe even late 70s, you know, we did have particularly those two people acquiring property with the intent that we could use it if we ever got to the point that we could do anything. And
Of course, the major piece of property we had to get was the one east of the building on our block.
yeah,
The one where this is right now.
Where the
Yes.
new building is now. Yeah.
But you know, I guess the first property that we acquired was the Aldersgate House, and that was acquired probably in the mid-'80s, maybe early '80s, and you know, with no particular plan as to what we'd be able to do with it. In fact, the thought was we might tear it down and build something else on it.
Did we get both of the houses at
No.
the same time? We
No.
didn't? Oh, okay.
No.
Okay.
When did we purchase the houses? Any idea?
Well,
Remember?
the first one, the Aldersgate House, was, I'm going to say, in the early '80s sometime. It was after Phil came, and so on, but I don't remember the exact dates. The second house, the one on the corner, there was several years later, in fact, maybe 6 or 8 years later. And and so those were the first two pieces of property that we had acquired on this block other than the original building. And but at that time, you know, we still had no specific plans as to what we could do or how to go about doing it.
What do you remember as far as the, when it came around to the renovation that included extending the elevator to the 4th floor and making all of the area up there accessible?
Accessible, that's right.
Oh, no, that happened in the late '70s, as I recall. And
I'm thinking of the late
No,
80s.
I think it was late 80s.
Was it late
Yeah,
80s?
Yeah, 'cause Phil
I
was
think I was
already-
chair of education at the
Okay,
time.
that probably happened when Dave Stapleton was still chair of trustees then. I was not involved in it and really.
Oh, you
didn't
weren't
know anything
particularly
about
involved in that?
No.
When did we actually begin to consider expansion as seriously as something that could be done, needed to be done just right away?
Well, after we did the all-congregation survey is when things really started moving. And and in fact, really the first thing that occurred is Sherma Dean was chair of the trustees at that time.
Who was that?
Sherma Dean. And we actually started, you know, and I was on the trustees at that time. And we started trying to think of, you know, what could we do? We know the congregation wants us to do something. And what can we do and what's going to be involved in doing it? And we decided the first thing we needed to do was to talk to some architects and just see what it was possible to do and what it would cost to do it. Excuse me. And actually we interviewed 6 or 8 architectural firms. I mean, they submitted us resumes and sample of their work, and we spent several months talking with each one of those firms, and ultimately settled on Bill Howard to draw some preliminary designs for us. And that's basically what he did, is draw us.
And who was that you said?
Bill Howard, the architect who ultimately
The
designed it.
architect we finally used?
Yes. And he drew us several alternative sets of plans. One of them involved actually extending both wings of the building north onto the north half of the block. That's when we became aware of Dave Stapleton's commitment that we wouldn't build anything big on the north half of the block. And the other major alternative was to expand east. So he did some preliminary designs for what, you know, just really conceptual things. And there were several options on both of them. Actually, by the way, one of the problems in extending north was fire problems also. If we attached anything to the old buildings, well, in fact, one possibility was to cover the walkway in between the two buildings and fill all of that in. And we discovered we would have had to sprinkle everything, and I mean, the cost was going to be extremely high, and it really ended up, cost-wise, going east was much more feasible because the old original wall of the building could be a firewall, and we didn't have to sprinkle the old building and do all the fire protection things in it by using that wall as a barrier and going into a new facility. And so all the doors going into the new facility are fire doors and things like that automatically close in case of fire.
Did the church have some funds at that time to allow for exploring, or do architects explore with you? Just
no, they charged for it, but it wasn't very expensive to do that. So we had enough money in the trustees' budget to do it. And so we really spent quite a few months, looking at various designs before we settled on a design. And in fact, we got the congregation involved in that process also. In fact, several different Sundays we had designs setting up in front of the sanctuary for people to look at to see what they thought. But ultimately, expanding east was the alternative that was selected. And then, Bill did do a rough outline of what we could do here and a cost estimate, because that was a critical part. And as I recall, the original cost estimate was roughly $5 million.
This was how much?
Roughly $5 million, a little more, a little less. So that gave us a target to shoot for how much money we needed to raise if we were going to do a project. And so, we didn't have any detailed plans. We just had a concept that we had settled on and a rough cost figure.
So what was the final cost?
We ended up spending about $7.5 million, but a lot of things were added, like expanding the south parking lot and things like that. So but initially what we were looking at just on this building was roughly $5 million.
So how do you get from, I'm sorry, you were going to say something?
Yeah, we had congregational meetings too, where we were trying to get people on board with everything and let them ask questions, so that they could understand exactly where we were headed. We had a bunch of those.
Yes.
Well, I think my next question was, how do you get from these just exploring steps into actually being ready to have a real plan and be ready to start fundraising?
Okay. Well, basically what Dianne said is there were quite a number of congregational meetings, some of them in the sanctuary, some of them in Meyer Hall. They were fairly lively discussions in those meetings.
I would say that, yes. And well attended.
And that's right, very well attended.
Well attended.
So, by the time we got to the point of, having a cost estimate, which was presented to the congregation, we had a pretty good feel that the congregation was strongly supportive of doing a project. And then came the hard work.
Well, yes, and trying to find a fundraiser to help us.
Yeah.
Too.
Which is raising the money. That's the hard work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so at that point, were we ready to go into fundraising?
Well, yes. We had a preliminary design. We had a cost estimate. The congregation was strongly supportive of doing something, so we were ready to raise money and see what we could get done. And so we hired a firm out of Dallas to help us with fundraising. That person was really very good. And by the way, the trustees did interview several different companies that help the church raise funds, and we selected this particular one. And And I discovered the secret to fundraising is you get every member of the church involved in working on the fundraising project, and then they will give money to it. And so the objective was to get every person on a committee of some sort.
Down the line.
Did you get everybody on one?
Yeah.
Well,
Yes,
got
we
a
did.
bunch of it,
Yeah, I got a lot of them. And
did.
I mean, there were hundreds of people serving on various committees in connection with that fundraising project.
So in this situation, then, do you have to wait until you have, or what should I say, how much of what it's going to take has to be pledged before you can actually go ahead and break ground and get started?
Well, really, we weren't going to start until we essentially had it all pledged. In other words, and I don't know what our final pledge total was, but it was right at the cost that we had estimated. And
At the estimated cost of $5 million?
yeah, roughly. So we felt comfortable going forward on that basis. In fact, our initial plan is we didn't want to borrow any money. So that was our objective, was to use the money that the congregation had pledged to the project and do the building.
Can you tell us any of the parts of the campaign? You've said that it was a matter of getting everybody on some kind of committee. Can you tell us how that was organized? And we remember something about some home meetings that we
Yes.
attended home
Yes.
meetings
Well,
at some point.
that was part of the process. Actually, the company we hired had a very detailed plan for us to
Yes.
follow.
Mhm.
In fact, they identified every job that needed to be filled, which was several hundred jobs.
Uh-huh.
And so, initially you were recruiting people for all of those jobs. Phil did most of that, by the way.
Well, that, for the top level jobs, because then it went down to, they selected members below
Yeah.
them, and they selected members below them, which is how you got to all the people being involved in the
Yeah.
church.
But in reality, Phil talked with everybody.
Oh, probably.
It was what, now say that again?
Phil really personally did recruiting for almost every job that was filled, and that's several hundred of them. And the gentleman who was running the campaign for us, or I won't say running it, he was guiding us in doing
Yes.
the campaign.
Yes.
He was what?
Guiding.
us, came up and held quite a number of meetings, some of them all church meetings, and he was a very dynamic, personable gentleman, an ordained minister also. He was from New England someplace. I think he was a congregational minister or something like that. But, a very dedicated man, and just very nice to work with. And so, we got all of the committees working. I mean, and part of it, there were committees to do everything, like the in-home meetings was part of the plan. And our objective was to get every person in the church in at least one meeting in a home where we could go over the project and get them thinking about how much they might consider giving to the project. And of course, that went on for many months. The process of getting all of this going, it may have taken 8 or 9 months before we got to the culmination of the fundraising effort.
Which was Palm Sunday
Yeah, Palm Sunday and Lloyd
at
Noble.
Lloyd Noble.
Okay, that was about my next question, was what can you remember about Palm Sunday at Lloyd Noble, just what happened there that day?
Well, it was glorious. It was just,
Oh, we were there.
it was just wonderful, the music, everything, and all the people being there. It was just,
Did we turn in our pledges then, or have we already turned
Yeah.
them in?
No, some people had turned them in, but the basic objective was that everyone who hadn't turned in a pledge turned them in then. So it was much like Pledge Sunday here at the church. People were passing in their pledge cards for the building.
Yeah.
And so it was really after that we had a number we could work with. And there were, of course, some that came in late, and as I recall, I think there was even a telephone campaign follow-up for people that we hadn't heard from, and things like that went on for another month or two. But the result was, at the end of it, we had pledges for roughly what we expected the building to cost. And
of course, that changed.
it did, due to a variety of issues.
Yeah.
And by the way, I should also say that In the meantime, we had gone ahead and started a more formal effort to acquire property. And so we had worked with James and Harold on the properties that they had purchased for our benefit, and acquired several other properties. It ends up there were two pieces of land that were critical for us that we were not having much luck acquiring. One was a house in the middle of the block on the north half of the block, and one was a house on the corner of Aspen University across the street from the church. And
The
both
big
of them,
two-story house.
Not
Yeah.
Aspen, Apache.
Apache
In University.
in University, and both of those were critical. The one on Apache and University was critical to be able to expand the parking lot. The one on the north half of the block, we had to relocate the alley going through the block north into her property in order to be able to build the building. And so, the alley doesn't follow down the middle of the block like it did originally. It's now moved north. Over on the west side, it's where it used to be, but it curves north to go around the new building. And that was for a variety of reasons, but we couldn't do anything till both of those properties were acquired. Well, the one at Apache and University burned down and gave us an opportunity to buy
The
that.
two-story house burned down?
Yeah, it was a three-story house. It was a big rooming
Was
house.
three-story?
Yeah, big rooming house. It burned down.
For some reason, I had always had in mind that they moved that. I know what I'm thinking of the Wesley Foundation, though. That's
Yeah.
good.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that house burned down. And then several months later, the house on the north half of the block burned down. And in fact, we used to tease Phil that, people who lived in houses that we wanted to acquire needed to be careful. But, by the way, in both cases, we paid them the amount we had originally offered them for the buildings. We didn't try to take advantage of them since their houses had burned down. The one on the north half of the block, it was very fortunate that the lady escaped alive. I mean, the house apparently was full of trash, had newspapers stacked all over it. It was a real mess. And but with those two acquisitions and what James had done, we did have the land then. Well, and what Harold had done. Because Harold also, James, by the way, spent years developing a relationship with every property owner any place close to the church. He would go visit them. I mean, he spent untold hours just developing relationships here in this community, local community. And so, the houses that were immediately east of the church, it was really through James' effort that we were ultimately able to acquire those, because they had originally said there was no way the church was ever going to own their property, even 1,000 years from now. They were going to put it in trusts and things where we could never get it. But really, James, I think, was instrumental in developing some relationships that, and I don't know what had caused them to feel that way. I mean, it was obviously something that had happened years earlier. And so, anyway, we were able to acquire all the property on the block here. And we acquired the north half of the block except for the service station south of the church. We hadn't done anything about the south half of the south parking lot at that point. That really came later while we were in the building project, that possibility came up. And so anyway, once we'd completed the fundraising effort, we then had Mr. Howard go ahead and create, complete detailed plans for the building. And also at that time, as we were developing detailed plans, we had started a building committee, and that committee consisted of 40 or 50 people. Those people all served on subcommittees for various parts of the building, and we had many meetings. I mean, for a long time, we were having one meeting a week.
Yeah.
just to go over various possibilities. I will have to tell you an aside about one of the members of the committee, Fred Zapfe, whom I know you know well, or knew well, because Fred, was a very, how do you describe Fred? He's a character. But Fred had a real knack for alienating people. In our building committee meetings, he would make everyone mad at him. It became a disruptive sort of issue almost. And I finally felt I just needed to talk with Fred about what was happening and how things were going. And for example, he was adamant that we should not have a single piece of PVC plastic pipe in this building. It all had to be copper pipe, which was much, much more expensive. and a number of issues like that. He was adamantly opposed to doing an atrium.
Atrium, yes.
He thought we should put a floor in it and have more Sunday school space. And so I finally called Fred one day, and specifically on the plumbing, I said, Fred, no one builds buildings with copper pipe anymore. That's very expensive. PVC is perfectly acceptable. And his immediate response to me was, he said, well, this building is special. It's God's house. It has to be better than anything else. So I got a very different perspective on Fred as a result of that meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, Fred and I ended up making a deal where when he came up with thoughts, Fred could just open his mouth and irritate people. But we worked out a deal. When he came up with thoughts, he would call me and tell me about them, and then I would present them to the committee again without alienating everyone. Because he really had some, he was a brilliant engineer.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. He was blonde.
He was. And so we developed a very good working relationship. In fact, in a minute I'll have to tell you a couple of other stories about Fred and the building, because he really was, he did some amazing things for
He
us.
saved us.
He did.
He saved us with the building.
And,
Tell us how he saved us.
well, I'll go ahead and tell you. Really three things I'll tell you about. Fred was always worried about roofs and leaks and things like this. And one day in the summer while we were in construction, in fact it was on a Saturday, I came up, and the building basically was all framed out and everything. And it was over 100 degrees outside. And I walked up to the door that goes out onto the roof over the atrium, and there was Fred sitting out there in a folding chair, looking at that, trying to figure out how we were going to keep that from ever leaking. But there were two other things that he did that really were amazing. The building plans for the building were extremely complicated, extremely detailed. And we were about halfway through construction, and we discovered that the mechanical consultant who was designing mechanical systems for the building had made two major errors. One is he hadn't put any air conditioning in the atrium. And
It was only going to be a pass-through space.
yeah, I said there
after all.
wasn't any need for air conditioning there. People were
They intentionally left it out.
Well, yeah, that's what I think it was just an oversight, but that was his explanation.
Yeah.
He said, there are never going to be any people in there, you don't need air conditioning. And the other was the roof drains of the space above the atrium, he had them flowing uphill.
Had one?
The roof drains, the drains were
yes.
flowing uphill,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't work well.
Not if you're trying to drain.
The mechanical consultant did a number of funny things, some of which ended up to our benefit. We ended up adding, 20 or 25 air conditioning units for the atrium. Fortunately, this was a chilled and hot water system. The mechanical consultant had specified a very odd size pipe, like the main pipes going in were, 2 3/16 pipe. Well, no one makes pipe that size, so the contractor just used 2.5-inch pipe.
Used what?
Had used 2.5-inch pipe
Oh.
instead, for example. And it ends up the pipe that the contractor used was sufficient to carry the extra load. So we didn't have to go back and replace a lot of pipe that had already been put in. And the mechanical consultant kept working on the roof drain system, and we had very limited space to work with because all of those drains run in above the walkway going around the atrium on the 3rd floor. And very limited space, particularly when we were adding fan coil units in there and things like that. And they could not figure out how to get the water to drain off the roof. And Fred ended up totally designing that system for us.
Really?
And they figured out how to get it all in where it would work, and it works beautifully. Fred did some amazing things for us. So
And then he died before it was completed.
he did.
Maybe 98, wasn't it?
Something like that. I
believe
don't
so.
know exactly, but anyway, he. I don't know how things would have ended up had we not had Fred to find things like that, because he was a very detail-oriented person, and I think he spent nights just going through drawings and everything. Actually, the contractor hated to see Fred come. And in fact, I also had to make a deal with Fred that he did not come on site of the building unless I was with him. Because, the contractor was threatening to, just ban him from the facility. Because he really, he wanted to make sure everything down to the nails were done in the right place. He was very detail oriented and drove them crazy. But we worked it all out. And the contractor did realize too, what a brilliant engineer Fred was and how much of a benefit he had been to us. And so, anyway, he was very helpful.
Could you give us probably kind of just an overview, and you've sort of been doing that already, from the groundbreaking? Didn't we had the groundbreaking was also on Palm Sunday 1 year after the 1 year or 2 years after the Lloyd Noble?
It was probably
Pretty sure we had
year.
it
It
on
was
Palm
probably
Sunday.
1 year.
Yes.
It was one,
Probably 1 year.
probably a year. But
We
kind
had the
of about
money, so.
comments about the whole business of getting this built.
Well, there were quite a number of issues that, fortunately, the contractor was, or at least our project foreman, and we had 2 different ones during the project. They were both very good people to work with. The first problem we ran into is and I don't know which sub of the architect was doing this, but there was a structural engineer that was doing drawings for structural steel for the building. Well, apparently he had 2 different people doing them, and when steel started arriving just as we were starting the project, we discovered the 2 halves of the steel drawings did not match. They were about a foot off. And so we were delayed for some time in getting the steel redone for 1 half of the building so it matched the other half of the building. And there were a number of issues like that, which you probably run into in every project like this. All during the construction, we continued to have meetings of the building committee. There were a lot of issues that we had to deal with. You have drawings, but then, you have to, and they show wall outlets in
Yeah, I
a
was just
certain ways,
thinking of them.
for example. But as you really get down to the details, you may want 2 wall outlets, and you may need them in different places. And we also got involved in looking at doing video capability between the sanctuary and Finn Hall. And what we had to do that. Actually, there are a lot of wires in walls that we have not yet used because it was much cheaper to put some wires in that we could access later. I don't even remember where they are now.
I hope there's a diagram somewhere.
Well, there is. But, you know, that was to be able to do video capability in every room at some point. So I think we have coax cables coming into every room. And, you know, just not put out in walls because we don't know for sure where we want them. And there were many issues with the city. Generally speaking, the city staff was very good to work with. But there were moments. I mean, for example, the fire marshal, he really wanted to complete a water main ring around the campus area for fire protection purposes. We were a critical part of that. He wanted us to put in a good part of that system.
He wanted to do what?
He wanted us to put a good part of his water mains.
Oh.
And so he came up with all sorts of technical issues about how close we had to be to water mains, and saying, you know, the building was not close enough to water mains, so we're going to have to put in a bunch more water mains. We ultimately worked out a compromise with the city where the city supplied the materials and we supplied the labor, and that was completed. And so the entire campus area benefited from that work. You know, a lot of issues with drainage. You know, the city basically says when you build a new building, particularly in the older part of Norman, you cannot have any water flowing into the stormwater drainage system faster than it flowed in before you built the building. So we had to calculate the roof area of all the houses we had taken down, the roof area we had on this building, and then we had to do a detention system to hold the water in place so it didn't drain into the stormwater drainage system faster than it did before. And that's the reason we've got the detention pond on the north half of the block. And actually a large part of the parking area on the north side of the building is part of the detention facility. And so actually as you drive out east of that parking area, there's a little hump, and that's really the dam. And so if it gets higher than that, it'll just flow out into the street. We also discovered in that process, you know, the corner of Apache and University Boulevard used to flood very badly.
It still does.
Well, it still does, but not as bad as it used to. We discovered in that process that water from several blocks north was flowing down University Boulevard and collecting at Apache, and that's the reason we flooded so bad. And it ends up there was a stormwater drain on the block north of the church that the stormwater pipe was there. It had just never been opened up to the street. And, I mean, that had probably been that way for 75 years. And so they opened that up. They put a new stormwater drain at the end of the alley, and that solved. I mean, it used to be that water would regularly get up high enough that it would flow down into Meyer Hall from that intersection. I don't think that happens anymore. I mean, it still gets several inches deep out there. We had to do the same thing with the south parking lot. The south parking lot, if you park in the southwest corner of the north half of that lot, you're going to find water that deep sometimes. There is a pipe that meters how fast water can flow out of that lot. And if it rains faster than that, it's simply, the parking lot becomes a lake. The south half of the lot is the same way. There's a little canal that we built on the very south edge, but the opening into that little canal is designed to meter how fast the water can run out of that area. And so, you know, the parking lots, I mean, those were big issues with the city. We had to hire an engineer who did all of those calculations for us. And it was really after the building was already in construction, by the way, that that the possibility evolved of building the south half of the south parking lot. And so we ended up acquiring all of the buildings that were on that property. And that's one of the reasons the price went up. You know, the price went up because of finding things like the air conditioning and various issues like that. And we made other changes in the process. And so that's how we ultimately got to roughly a $7.5 million project. And we did end up borrowing roughly $2.5 million by the time everything was completed. And so but we have an amazing congregation. We have people with amazing talents in building, interior design, you know, child care, all sorts of areas like that, you know, where their talents were critical for getting the project to come together on a basis that made a very usable final result. And I mean, there were other issues. I mean, we got the windows in that are in the skylights above the atrium. They were clear glass. Well, that would have made the atrium an oven. The glass that's up there now, so before it was put in, we had to send it back and get it redone. The glass that's up there now, when you look at it, it looks like it's clear glass, but it's actually 85% reflective.
Really?
You only get 15% of the sunlight coming through to the atrium. And but it feels like it is, you know, total sunlight that you're getting. And so many issues like that occurred during the project that, you know, caused the price to go up. I think the final price of the building itself was probably around $6 million. And we had other interesting issues. The city decided that the pipe that carried exhaust gases above the kitchen hood, although it was a pipe approved by UL for that purpose, I mean, it's a triple wall pipe, I think. After we had already put it in, the city decided, well, you've got to wrap insulation around that too. But you know, we already had ceiling in Finn Hall, and so we ended up having to take a lot of that out to get up and wrap fiberglass insulation around the pipe, which was already, you know, triple wall thickness. But you know, those are issues you run into. But as I said, the city, Pat Copeland, who was the head of the building inspection department, was really a prince of a gentleman to work with. He ran a lot of interference for us, and was just a super person to work with. So,
yeah. I have several times commented how ironic it is that in 1924, 23 and 24, when they were building the original building, it took about 1.5 years with their equipment and all, and it took, what, about 3 years?
yes. Well, now,
Maybe a
the
little
major
bit more.
problem we ran into was the limestone itself.
Yes.
But they didn't have a city to deal with it.
Yeah, they didn't have a city to deal with. But we were delayed for 1 year just waiting for limestone. And and there were some, I mean, some of that had to be redesigned. There was one particular block, not very far from where we're sitting now, that the company doing the limestone said, to cut that block, we have to cut it from the inside of the stone. And that's not easy to do. So that stone had to be redesigned so it could be cut from the outside.
We've mentioned several people. Can you just quickly mention names that should be remembered from the very beginning, from finance campaign to people like you have mentioned, Fred, who was so important to the building.
Well, yes.
People that
of course, Andy and Terry Payton were co-chairs with us of the fundraising effort, and they did a lot of work.
Yeah.
Very good people. You know, on the building committee, the chairs of each of the subcommittees did a tremendous amount of work. You know, Lee Rogers was in charge of Finn Hall. Actually, Bob Cornell was in charge of the kitchen area, and he had a stroke. His stroke occurred during the building. Bob Warner ended up taking that over He had not been here when the project started, but he had come and he took over the kitchen project, and he saved us a lot of money. I mean, he found good used things and other things that are still in service today.
Mary Voller.
Yeah, Mary Voller was in charge of the children's area.
She was in charge of which area?
Children's area, I think, or was it the youth area? The engineer who lives on Berry Road. Talented children, grandchildren, and sings in the choir. And I'm blocking on his name. He was with the Army Corps of Engineers.
Vernon
Vernon
Davis.
Davis, yes.
Mhm.
In fact, Vernon really became our on-site
Yeah.
supervisor. After Vernon had retired from the Army Corps of Engineers, he became a building construction supervisor for the state of Oklahoma. And he really knew what he was doing, and so he basically lived at the building during the construction phase, and he is the one who made sure everything was done right. Said Fred Zaffe tried to help a lot, but Vernon is really the one who was in charge from our perspective of doing the building. Let's see, the pharmacist.
Tommy Bishop.
Yeah, Tommy Bishop was one of the committee chairs. Who else? And there were several others. And we did add a lot of other things. I mean, for example, we wanted to redo the floor in at the south entrance of the old building, and the vestibule outside the atrium, outside the sanctuary where the stairs come up. That floor was in very bad condition. In fact, parts of the floor outside the sanctuary, supposedly concrete, but you could move it a lot by walking on it.
Mhm.
And when we uncovered a lot of that, we discovered the concrete, when it had been poured outside the sanctuary, had frozen while it was still wet, and so it was almost like powder. And so we ended up, replacing a lot of that flooring. Well, we did replace all the flooring, but had to replace a lot of concrete there. And so, we did expand the project some into the new building. And of course, right after we completed that project, we went ahead and redid Meyer Hall also, which was technically a separate project. In fact, when Bill Howard had done his design, he really designed 3 phases. The first phase was the new building. The second phase was Meyer Hall. The third phase, which we've never done and probably will never do, was a building on the north half of the block. And but we did go ahead and do phase 2 right after we had completed that, and that was part of the $2.5 million that we borrowed, was redoing the Meyer Hall area, expanding the choir room, and changing all of that around. So, all in all, with the project, from the time we started fundraising until we finished, was right at 10 years.
Right at one?
Right at 10 years.
Mm.
Well, or from the time we started planning, I should say.
Planning, yes,
until,
planning.
Until we finished was right at 10 years. So that's typical Methodist church.
Yeah.
So,
And it's a good thing.
that's right.
A lot of oversight and a lot of mistakes caught, and
Yeah, a lot of
A lot
input
done
from
like
a
it
lot of
should be.
people.
And a lot of consensus building in the congregation,
Yes.
which
So-
was necessary in order to raise the money.
well, I have come to the end of my questions. What else do y'all think of, do either of you think of anything that should be
Yeah.
said? Diane, you haven't said very much.
Yeah, I was, I don't know how much you have talked about the organ,
Oh, yeah.
because I was on the organ committee when we were going to replace the organ that we had.
Mhm.
And that was a $500,000 project, which got some flack from the congregation, but in that process, we decided that we would not ask for any budget money. We would raise all of the money for the organ separately from the budget. So we had dinners and we had all kinds of stuff to raise money. selling pipes, all that kind of stuff. But we looked around we did a lot of education for our committee first on what was needed, what was available, would we go electro-pneumatic tracker, and came to some decisions. We looked at a lot of the organ builders, both in the area and away. We took several trips. We went on a trip to Dallas to listen to different organs made by different builders down there. And an interesting part of that, Art Waldenville was the chair of the committee. And every place, if the organist knew how to play it, we wanted to hear the Vidor toccata on the Vidor toccata on the organ, just to hear how it sounded. Art was in love with that piece, and subsequently all of us became in love with that piece. And now they do it at Easter, so that's wonderful. We love it. We also took a trip to Boston to listen and interview some organ builders up there, one of which was Fritz Nowak, who ended up being our organ builder. One of the problems we had is that all of the organ builders had long waiting lists before they could ever get to building an organ for us. We loved the sound of Fritz's, and he did not have as long a waiting list as others. There's another really good organ builder in Boston that we thought about, Fisk. It just came to me. Isn't that nice? But he had just died, and we weren't sure there was anybody else that was going to be carrying his business on. So we really kind of crossed him off our list. Well, as it turns out, Fisk Organ is still a good organ company. They built the organ that's in Gothic Hall in Catlett that was installed there. But we also went to Savannah, Georgia, to hear when they dedicated Fritz's 100th opus organ in Savannah. But we learned an awful lot. The idea of the embossing on our pipes at the front came about through some of the things we learned, and I think that just adds a wonderful dimension to those pipes at the front of the organ. Because the organ pipes at the front of the sanctuary originally were fake pipes. They did not play.
Right.
And a lot of people didn't understand that, and so we decided we would change those for real pipes that sounded. But there was just a group of us that felt like this church needed an organ commensurate with the building, and we didn't have it with the old organ, and dedicated people who were willing to really work to raise the money and get it for.
Was the organ that was replaced the original from 1924?
Yes, it was.
I was thinking
Howlett, something.
I don't know.
I can't remember. It's a two name, but one of the names was Howlett.
And by the way, one other person that we have not mentioned who was critical in both the organ and the building project is the person who gave large gifts for that, and I can't even think of her name right now.
Louise Perkinson.
Louise Perkinson.
Say that again?
Louise
Yes.
Perkinson. I mean, she gave probably half the cost of the organ, and close to $1 million to the building project. And I mean, and there were other significant contributors, and of course every gift was very important on both projects. But she, without the large gifts that she made, I don't think either project would have come out nearly as well as it did, I'll put it that way.
Well, when we first started fundraising for the organ, there was an anonymous $100,000 gift that came in that just sort of ignited the committee and the people that were trying to do the fundraising in the congregation, thinking, okay, we've got to start.
Yeah. Well, and she did everything anonymously, by the way. In fact, she refused to let, and I don't know myself how much she gave. In fact, I'm sure she gave many millions of dollars to the church. I had talked with Phil one time, and he said he told her that he was going to name the organ for her, and she refused to let that happen as long as she was alive. I mean, she wanted to keep everything anonymous. So I don't know exactly how much she gave, but I said I suspect her gifts to the building project were close to $1 million. And
Well, and was it her gift that really got the McFarland Foundation going?
yes, she made a large gift to start so she gave millions of dollars to this church.
Yes, in Phil's interview with us, one of the things he said was that the Perkinson sisters insisted that he not mention them at all until they were all dead.
Yes. So, anyway, you know, people like that really made a lot of things possible. I mean, other people might have stepped up, but they, in fact, were the people who did step up with large amounts of money that made a big difference for us.
Well, I think we have about come to the end. Either one of you have anything really vital more that we need to add?
No.
I know that
Ken?
there's going to be all
Ken?
kinds of things we'll think about that we should have talked about.
Sure. No,
That's always the
I-
case. We may have to come back in 6 months and try again.
Okay.
But appreciate you so much for sharing your experiences and your knowledge of this phase of McFarland. And I hope that we will be returning to you a copy so that you can
Oh.
play back and listen to what you
See how
said.
bad